What's up guys, Tommy Bowyer here from Movie Rewind. Welcome to another video, and today I am doing a Friday the 13th tier ranking. Now, I watched the original Friday the 13th when I was 16 years old and I thoroughly enjoyed it, but for some reason I never watched any of the others until this year. I saw the 8-disc Blu-ray box set in HMV, decided to buy it, thoroughly enjoyed every one, so I bought the rest. And now I've seen all of them, and I thought it'd be a fun idea as someone who has, just freshly got Friday the 13th in their mind, that I would do a tier ranking. Now, a few things before we get into this ranking. Firstly, this will contain spoilers, so if you haven't seen any of these Friday the 13th films, I would highly recommend seeing them before you watch this video. Secondly, this is my personal opinion. Obviously, I'm biased just like everyone else in the world, so please bear that in mind. And thirdly, an S ranking is a Friday the 13th film which I consider faultless. There's no criticisms of it whatsoever. And an F tier is a Friday the 13th film which I struggle to watch all the way through. And just like any film, rewatchability is very important. If you're watching a film and you just want to turn it off halfway through, then it's clearly not a film you're enjoying. Now, for me, Friday the 13th is at its best when it's scary and also when it's entertaining. I think Friday the 13th, it's not ashamed to not take itself too seriously, and it just wants everyone to have a good time. And definitely with the majority of these films, you're definitely going to have a good time. So with all of that out of the way, let's get on with this ranking. Now, Friday the 13th, released in 1980, the original. I'm going to put this in the C tier. Now, I get it. It's iconic. It's the one that started it all. The special effects from Tom Savini are brilliant. I love Betsy Palmer as Mrs. Voorhees. I think it's a great twist that the killer is actually a middle-aged woman who's mourning her son. But I don't think it stands out compared to other entries in the franchise. I think it is definitely just Sean Cunningham trying to make a Halloween film. And while I think it does have its scary moments, it is a very predictable slasher film. So for me, it's definitely a meh Friday the 13th film. While I enjoy it, it's nowhere near the best one, so I've put it in the C tier. Now, Friday the 13th Part 2. This is my favourite Friday the 13th film, and I'm going to put it in the A tier. Now, I think that Part 2 really does improve on the first one, and it was only released a year later. It was released in 1981. And I thoroughly enjoy Part 2. It's got my favourite final girl, Ginny. She is great. She's actually a capable final girl. She's not just there to scream and run. She's actually an interesting character. And that goes for all of the characters in this film. They're actually interesting people. You'd like to spend more time with them. And some of them, you're glad they survived. And you're upset that they died. So I think that's good. They really do have good characters in Part 2. Jason Voorhees makes his debut as the main villain, and he is brilliant. I love the baghead look. I get that it's not the classic hockey mask, but I think that the baghead look is really interesting. Plus, I like that this Jason does set traps as well. And also, he's a bit more human. He's not undead yet, so that does make him, in my opinion, a bit more scarier. But for me, Part 2, it just improves on the first one on all levels, and it clearly showed that Jason Voorhees was definitely the way going forward. Next, we have Part 3, released in 1982. This used the gimmick of 3D, which was becoming very popular in the early 1980s in horror films. I'm going to put Part 3 in the B tier. Now, I can really appreciate this film for the 3D effects. Some of them look a little cheesy, I'm not gonna lie, but then others, like when Jason harpoons that woman in the boat, are actually really good. And you can tell that a lot of effort went into making this film. I mean, a lot of people kind of turn their noses up at Friday the 13th films, saying, oh, they're so cheap and so easy to make, But part 3, a lot of effort went into the 3D effects, and I think that's a great thing. I think Jason becomes the Jason we know and love in this film. He's now bald, he's now a giant, he's wearing the hockey mask, so it's definitely a more traditional Friday the 13th film. Once again, I enjoy the characters in this film. I like how it's not set at a summer camp. It changes it up. We follow a group of friends who are going to a farm, and I really enjoyed part 3. I think that it's not as good as part 2, simply because part 2 had that great chase scene at the end of the film. I don't think that part 3 has that, but it's still a very strong Friday the 13th film, and it's definitely where Jason becomes the Jason that everyone recognises. Next we have Friday the 13th, the final chapter, released in 1984, and this is an S tier. This is without a doubt the best Friday the 13th film, and I think a lot of people would agree with me on this one. The only criticism of it is that final chapter. Yeah, that was bullshit, but it was supposed to be the final entry in the franchise up until that point, and I think it's great. You've got Ted White as Jason Voorhees, I would say the best actor to portray the character, and definitely his performance in this is something which future actors who went on to portray the character have definitely been influenced by. Once again, I enjoy the characters. I don't know what it was about these early Friday the 13th films, but the characters, even some of the more disposable characters who are just there to up the kill count, they're actually fun characters. You can imagine spending time with them. These feel like real people, and you actually care if some of them live or die. I think introducing Tommy Jarvis and his family was also an interesting idea, because it adds another layer of danger, the fact that Jason is quite happy to kill a kid. Like, that's just something that we haven't seen in a Friday the 13th film before. So that was very interesting. The kills are amazing. Tom Savini returned to do the special effects, and, he ups his game on this one compared to the first one. It's one of those films, it's fun, it's scary, it's entertaining. It will have you on the edge of the seat, you'll see, especially the final confrontation. And it's definitely Friday the 13th at its very best. Next we have Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. Now, this one was released in 1985, so just a year after the final chapter. So clearly the final chapter weren't the final chapter. And a lot of people don't like this one because they say that, it doesn't have Jason Voorhees in it. It's a copycat. But I'm going to put it in the C tier because I don't think it's that bad. I think it's interesting having a kind of mystery around who is actually the killer. They make it very obvious that it's the paramedic. It's not subtle at all. I think that is one thing they could have done better, the mystery around who this killer is. But it's interesting seeing an adult Tommy Jarvis struggle to deal with what happened that night and keep seeing hallucinations of Jason Voorhees, because we've never really seen a survivor, apart from Alice in the first film, kind of come to terms with what happened when Jason entered their lives. So it's very interesting with A New Beginning. I think that it gets overhated. I can understand why people don't like it, especially as it's not Jason Voorhees, it's just a copycat killer. But some of the deaths are interesting, and that final scene with Tommy Jarvis being teased as the next Jason, I wish that plot line might have gone somewhere, because it might have given Tommy Jarvis an interesting arc. Obviously, that was forgotten by the time Part 6 came along. But I think that Part 5 is definitely underrated. Next, we have Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. Now, this is... I know Scream always gets kind of praised for being the first meta horror film, but Jason Lives was released in 1986 and it is a meta horror film straight through. I'm going to put Jason Lives in the A tier because I think that Jason Lives is just such a fun film. It's one of those films where you can tell everyone involved was having a great time. It concludes Tommy Jarvis's arc with him for some reason, in his effort to make sure that Jason is dead, he ends up bringing him back to life. And then the rest of the film sees Jason just killing everyone he comes across. But I think there's a lot of Easter eggs in this for Friday the 13th fans, as well as horror fans more generally. There's some interesting characters in this, and it actually has a summer camp with kids, which does make it a bit more creepy, because obviously no one wants to see kids in danger. And that scene where Jason is in the girl's sleeping quarters, and he's looking at that little girl, and she's trying to wish that he didn't exist. That is very scary. That's very tense. I have to admit, I was on the edge of my seat during that scene. This is where Jason becomes a zombie. You know, he's the undead by now. So, obviously, it's a lot harder to kill him. And that final confrontation between him and Tommy Jarvis on the boat, I thought was really interesting. You know, it's exciting. It's fun. And some of the deaths in this film, you know, they're brilliant. They really are good deaths. So, Jason Lives, it was fun. They clearly weren't taking themselves too seriously, and what it gave horror fans was a very fun ride. Next we have Friday the 13th Part 7, The Next Generation. Now this one was released in 1988, and to be honest, I'm not a massive fan of the New Blood. Now I understand what they were going for here. Have Jason face someone with telekinetic powers, you know, make it a bit harder for him. And obviously this is when Kane Hodder took over the role of Jason, a role he would portray for the next 4 films, and he is brilliant. You know, I'm not gonna take any jabs at Kane Hodder. He's fantastic as Jason Voorhees. But for me, this film I find boring. The characters are not as likable as they have been up until this point, and I find the lead interesting. Like, I like how the fact that she is feeling guilty over her father's death, and a lot of the film is dedicated to her trying to come to terms with that grief. But I just found this one a little boring. I don't think it's as exciting as Jason Lives was. So I'm going to put The New Blood in the D tier, because I just don't think it is as good as the others. Next we have Jason Takes Manhattan, Friday the 13th Part 8, F tier. I hate Jason Takes Manhattan. I think it is awful, to be honest. This was the last film made by Paramount Pictures, and you could tell they couldn't care less about this film up by this point. You know, they were simply just milking the franchise for everything it was worth. And Jason Takes Manhattan, the title is misleading, because the majority of this film is set on a cruise ship where he kills a bunch of kids who are going to New York on a graduation trip. And then the last half hour is set in New York. And to be honest, I don't like this film one bit. Kane Hodder is the only highlight as Jason. You know, as I said, he's great in the role. But for the most part, this is just a bad film. You know, there's even a really weird scene where this girl is nearly raped by 2 gangsters. And I don't know, it's scenes like that which just make you feel really uncomfortable, but not in a good way. So yeah, it's the worst Friday the 13th film in my personal opinion. Next we have Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, released in 1993. This was the first film made by New Line Cinema, because Paramount Pictures sold them the rights to Jason Voorhees, but not Friday the 13th. So that's why all the films made by New Line Cinema don't actually use the title Friday the 13th, because they're not allowed to. So this was Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. Sean Cunningham returns to produce this film, and a lot of people hate this film. I went into this film thinking it was going to be terrible, because a lot of people say that this is the worst Friday the 13th film. And this might be an unpopular opinion. I don't think it's that bad. I think that some of the later Paramount films were literally just the same thing over and over again. Jason Goes to Hell does actually try to do something different. It tries to explain Jason's origins and how he gets his powers, which I find very interesting. I didn't mind him swapping between different bodies. I thought it was quite interesting and fun. So I think that Jason Goes to Hell is underrated. A lot of the death scenes I really enjoy. You have got Kane Hodder as Jason. Yeah, he's not in it as much as other films, but he's still in it. So for me, Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday, is underrated. So I'm actually going to put it, and I can hear people getting angry at me, I'm going to put it in the C tier. Because I thoroughly enjoyed this film, and I think it is underrated. Next we have Jason X, released in 2002. Now, basically, the reason there was a 9-year gap between Jason Goes to Hell and Jason X is because they were trying to get a Freddy versus Jason film off the grounds, and obviously that was stuck in production hell. So they decided, New Line Cinema, to, milk the franchise a bit and make Jason X. And I have to say about the New Line films, they really do take out their concepts. They try and do something different. This time, we see Jason in the far future. We see him encounter a futuristic ship where he just ends up killing the crew once he's awoken from hibernation. And you know what? This film is just fun. Much like Jason Lives, it's not taking itself seriously, but I don't think it has to. It just doesn't need to. It's just Jason Voorhees killing people. And sometimes that's all you need. Kane Hodder makes his final appearance as Jason, and he doesn't disappoint. He's once again really good in the role. And I think that this film is underrated. I think more people are appreciating it now. I think Uber Jason is a very cool design for Jason Voorhees. It adds something different. This was the final film in the original series, so many people say this is the film which killed the original series. But you know what? I'm going to put Jason X, I'm going to put it in the D tier. Because it does have its problems, don't get me wrong. And I think it's paced a little slowly, and it goes on probably 15 minutes too long. But I still thoroughly enjoyed it. And last but not least, we have the remake, Friday the 13th, released in 2009. And I have really mixed feelings about this film. I wanted to go in loving it. And I have to say, it's great to kind of get a return to the format of Jason Voorhees killing people at Camp Crystal Lake. But it is the characters which damage this film. Now, the opening scene is brilliant. The opening scene, if that was replicated in the rest of the film, it'd definitely be A tier or maybe even S tier. Even the characters in the opening scene seem like normal, fun characters. But then we move on to the ones we're stuck with the whole movie. And the majority of them are so unlikable, it angers me. I don't know what has happened to horror film characters. But especially around the late 2000s and early 2010s, they were just made to be douchebags. In the 80s, in the majority of the early Friday the 13th films, yes, loads of characters died, but they were at least likeable. They felt like real people. You'd want to spend time with them. In this film, you just wonder, you know what, why should I care if these characters live or die? I'm rooting for Jason Voorhees in this. Now, the actor, and I can't remember his name, but the actor who portrays Jason is really good. He was inspired by Ted White's legendary performance, and he does a good job. And I like how he's more of a survivalist. He sets booby traps, he lays bait. That is interesting. It's something different, and he does have a good design. But it's the characters which really let this film down. And the final chase scene, I felt was a bit underwhelming. I've seen better chase scenes. So this is going to be the most controversial pick ever, I think. I'm going to put the remake in the E tier. Because I was very disappointed with it. Primarily due to the characters. They're just so unlikable. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe in order to receive great and maybe even improved quality content in the future. As I said, I've only just recently watched all of the Friday the 13th films. And as I said, anything in the F tier is a film that I would struggle to watch. Especially for the most part, there's only one film out of the franchise which I would struggle to watch. And that is Jason Takes Manhattan. For the most part, I enjoy the Friday the 13th films. And I hear that there's still rumours that they might be making a new film. But obviously there's loads of rights issues. There's loads of production problems. But if they ever did do another remake of Friday the 13th, I would say look at part 4, part 2 and part 6, because those three show that you just need good characters a scary atmosphere, but you also just need to make it fun and entertaining for the audience as well. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to tell me what your ranking would be. I'm sure it would be different to mine, but I'd love to hear what your rankings would be. And I will see you in another one. See ya!